The Satellarknight archetype is an interesting one, for despite the successes it has demonstrated since arriving on the scene in earnest, including winning the 2015 World Championship, having never really been hit directly on any ban list in the TCG, only a small indirect hit leading reinforcement of the army to drop from 3 to 1, the deck has seen a significant drop-off in play over the last year and a half. This is not to say that Stellarknights do not see any play at all, but for a deck of its caliber, still functioning at almost full power, to see such little proportional play relative to everything else that's played in the meta is rather baffling to me, especially since receiving a critical piece of support in Invasion of Vengeance that patched up one of the major weaknesses of the deck. Let's see how I would run Satellarknights, starting with the direct support. While Raigeki is one of the heaviest hitters from the main deck, and can even bump himself or another Satellarknight 500 attack points when summoned, this attack increase does come at the cost of the targeted monster being sent to the graveyard during the end phase. Interestingly enough, this cost is not a big deal when considering the potential benefits of certain cards going to the graveyard for this deck. However, a 500 attack point increase is just not good enough to warrant the deck space, in my opinion. Also, Raigeki does not have a place in the primary play strategy that makes Satellarknights effective in the first place. Before the new Zephyr support, Yang Zing and Satellarknights were the two archetypes that could actually get some level of play out of their Zephyr cards. Unfortunately, Zephyr is the weaker of the two, for it has the standard nothing but a restriction for its pendulum effect, and its monster effect is garbage, for it cannot destroy itself, nor can it prevent chaining. If this card were better, then running a Zephyr Satellarknight hybrid might have been an interesting possibility. However, that is not the case, for this card struggles to justify a place in the deck, or even a place in existence. The Satellarknight specific Foolish Burial Unukalhai is an important piece to increasing the efficiency of the deck, for it provides another means to access Deneb in a dump and revive capacity. Its 1800 attack and Satellarknight name are also pluses. However, due to deck space issues, I only run 2 copies instead of 3. Altair is one of the 2 most important cards in the deck due to its revival effect, providing numerous XZ and effect activation opportunities. Frequently, Altair will summon Deneb, providing a +2 from his effect, and the opportunity to make an XZ play. Of course, it makes sense that such an effect would have a meaningful restriction, and Altair's comes with the summoned monster being in defense position, and the inability to attack with all non-Satellarknight monsters. Fortunately, these restrictions are not meaningful problems, and can be worked around rather easily. 3 copies, always. Sirius is one of the 2 second-tier Satellarknights, in my opinion, that fight for deck space. Sirius has the advantage over its competitor due to its Satellarknight monster-specific Jar of Avarice effect that can trigger whenever it is summoned. Not surprisingly, Sirius excels in those games that become very grindy, where all of your Altairs are sitting in the graveyard, along with some Satellarknight XZ monsters, and both players are somewhat low on resources. However, early game, not surprisingly, he's rather worthless. Fortunately though, because both Deneb and Yuke's effect can manipulate the summons potential of Sirius, you only need to run 1 to really get the most out of his effect. Thus, I only run the 1 copy. Altair's partner in crime, Deneb, is the other most important monster in the deck. The ability to search Satellarknight makes Deneb a +1 machine, and critically important to maximizing the playmaking capacity of the deck. 3 copies. Always. Alsham is the other monster that competes for deck space with Sirius. The 1000 effect damage that it produces when summoned is definitely nothing to scoff at. However, in my opinion, most of the time, Satellarknights will almost force the opponent into grind games, making Sirius more attractive in the long term than Alsham. Right now, Alsham's effect produces little principal combination efficiency. Running 1 is alright in a similar vein to Sirius, but I choose to use that deck spot differently. Procyon is not a bad card, but it's also not that useful. If this card allowed you to send a 1 Tellarknight monster in the field to the graveyard, or send 1 Tellarknight monster in your hand to the graveyard to get its draw effect, then it would be amazing, and I'd probably run it at least 1, more than likely 2. But the fact that you have to go from your hand to your graveyard. With the low monster count that Satellarknight decks typically run, its draw effect just becomes less consistent. You also have that confliction with targets. Sure, you don't mind sending a Deneb to grave, but you would mind sending that Vega or Altair. Overall, the card just doesn't have enough consistency and usefulness in its draw effect. Vega is the third member of the combo triumvirate, summoning Altair from the hand, then letting Altair summon a third Satellarknight, mostly Deneb, from the graveyard, giving the player all the required pieces for either Delteros and Triverr. However, with the ability of a certain new XZ monster in the fold, Vega has become, I don't want to say controversial, but more interesting in the discussion of whether to run 2 or 3 copies. Some would argue that, well, now Vega is not critical for combo success anymore, so you can only run 2. Others would argue, oh, Vega's even more important now because Vega summon Satellarknight X from your hand, and you make your new XZ, and you proceed to make your plays. Right now, I feel running 2 copies is the better strategy over 3, because I like to use that 1 spot of deck space for something else, but I certainly cannot begrudge anyone who chooses to run 3. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Every archetype has a runt of the litter, so to speak, and Capella is definitely the runt here. At the moment, this card is just horrible, largely due to the 3-card minimum requirement for the effect activation for changing the levels from 4 to 5. If only 2 monsters were required, basically the card functioned as similar to Constellar Chaos in a sense, then it would be worth running a single copy for possible rank 5 plays, even though extra deck space in Satellarknights is still rather tight. Unfortunately, that is not the case. If Betelgeuse was a skybridge for the graveyard, or could innately special summon itself some way, it would be interesting. However, because it only adds the card to the hand instead of summoning it, and you lose it from the field in the process, this guy is just not good enough. He's a little too slow for my taste. In a sense, this card could have had potential even if it only demanded tributing any Satellarknight on the field, not necessarily itself, but that's not the case. Zephyr Thurbin is a slightly better Zephyr with the ability to destroy face-up cards over set cards, but it is still substandard in my opinion. If only this monster effect was its pendulum effect, then this card would be rather useful. Unfortunately, that is not the case. It does have its moments, it's just those moments are not frequent nor spectacular enough to warrant running it in my opinion. Diamond is another version of Utopia the Lightning in the respects that its actual summoning condition is really never used, for its XZ overlay summoning ability is preferred. While Satellarknights were at their height, Diamond was the terror of Burning Abyss decks, almost exclusively shutting them down, preventing deck-to-graveyard plays, and preventing dark monster effects. Unfortunately, Diamond has fallen on some harder times in the existing meta, with few high-quality dark decks roaming the environment, although it may see a small revival because of the emergence of DDDs. However, every Satellarknight extra deck should have room for at least 1 copy. Mine has room for that 1 copy. Meet the newest XZ monster for Satellarknights, one that plugs one of the biggest weaknesses for the deck. This weakness is easy to get 2 main deck Satellarknights on the field. The problem was always getting that third for your Triverr or Delteros plays. Summoning an Altair and then getting Altair's effect off, easy. Getting that third copy, either through a principal Vega summoning first, or still having your normal summons because you summoned Altair off a Call of the Haunted, not as consistent. To make matters worse in this situation, because that 2 monster presence was commonly produced through Altair's effect, which meant that any XZ play you made in the past, before Invasion of Vengeance, meant, well, you're not summoning a Satellarknight, so while you might summon a Castel and spin something, that Castel can't attack for that turn because of Altair's effect. Darktellarknight Batlamyus fixes both those problems. He's a 2600 attack Satellarknight that only requires 2 Satellarknight monsters, and with a single detachment and 1 discard from the hand, can either bring out Delteros or Triverr. There is a word for this. Beautiful. The other 2 effects are there, but typically not really that useful. While the conversion of dark monsters on the field to a dark attribute seems to have some value in either supporting Diamond's effect or combo potential with a card like Mask Change 2 to summon Dark Law, in my opinion these strategies produce too much natural inefficiency for the deck. For example, I would rather make a 4 or 5 material number 86 than make a Batlamyus and then somehow either go into a second one or a third material Satellarknight to make a diamond. The best result from the dark attribute effect, in my opinion, is stopping non-dark attribute specific extra deck summons like Bahamut Shark or Naturia Beast. The quick play effect is not useful because it involves running too many subpar Satellarknight main deck monsters. Despite the lack of general usefulness to these other effects, the dark attribute effect does have its moments, though. The ability to make a 2-material Satellarknight XZ monster that can, heck, just attack in general, but also promote itself to Delteros or Triverr if needed, is just too good. 2 copies. Sometimes I feel Delteros has gotten the shaft in player appreciation. It provides protection after it is first summoned, can pop any card anywhere on the field for a single material detachment, hits at a decent 2500, and has an effect most players who are not experienced Satellarknight players tend to forget or not even know. When this card goes to the graveyard, by any means, it can special summon 1 Satellarknight from the deck. This effect is very nice for maintaining field presence and forcing the opponent into a grind game, where typically Satellarknight have a significant advantage. The fact that this effect occurs regardless of how it's sent to the graveyard is a key element and can produce some interesting tech choices for this deck. Unlike most, who tend to run him only at 1, I like running him at 2 copies. In contrast to Delteros, when players talk or think about the Satellarknight archetype, one particular monster always comes to mind: Triverr, and with good reason. Triverr is a beast, for when it is XZ summoned, it automatically activates a non-target bounce for all cards on the field that are not him. If that were not enough, detach a material to randomly send 1 card from the opponent's hand to the graveyard. Triverr also has a similar effect to Delteros, although not as consistent, for when it's sent to the graveyard with XZ material, you can special summon 1 Satellarknight from the graveyard. Not much more to say about Triverr that has not already been said. It's a great card, and I run him at 2 copies because of Sirius's recycling effect. Batlamyus was properly banned, and hopefully will never see the playing field ever again without a meaningful errata. Skybridge is an interesting tech choice for attempting to maximize the efficiency of the deck. The general purpose of Skybridge is getting Deneb to the field as fast as possible by swapping out any Satellarknight for the searching combo jump starter, that is Deneb. Skybridge can also be helpful for getting Altair out for Batlamyus play. However, the big problem with Skybridge in my eye is after the first 2 turns, it basically becomes a dead draw. And since the general strategy in my mind of Satellarknights is to create grind game with the opponent versus being an explosive deck, because it really does not have the archetype tools to be an explosive deck, losing a draw on turn 5 or turn 7 because you draw Skybridge can shift the duel in your opponent's favor. Also, Skybridge can be a dead draw early if you already have a means to put Deneb on the field, because the original target is returned to the deck rather than sent to the graveyard. While Skybridge is definitely a valid option, especially for reactionary purposes to avoid a monster getting its effect negated by a non-solemn card, it is one valid option I choose not to run. The newest spell and trap support for Satellarknights, Genesis, is not as good as I think some people give it credit for. A number of players have the opinion that Genesis has replaced Twin Twister and Satellarknight for those who choose to run Twin Twister. I disagree, because Genesis fails to support the most important aspect of the Satellarknight deck in my opinion: the normal summons on an empty board, especially early. The need to have at least 1 Satellarknight on the field to trigger Genesis is a meaningful problem, especially against Solemns. For example, summon Deneb, and the opponent flips over a Solemn. The Genesis is dead in hand for that turn, and your play stops, versus using a Twin Twister before summoning the Deneb to clear most, if not all, of the threats to that normal summons. Yes, Genesis does have the potential to net a +2, +3, or even a +4, but a vast majority of time, when that big plus occurs, the game is largely already swung hugely in the favor of the Satellarknight player. Basically, I view Genesis as a win more or frontrunner card. It does not help you shift momentum to your favor or protect your combo starters. In some sense, simply seems to kick the opponent while he or she is already down, and that's not what this deck needs. Alpha is actually a pretty solid equip card, making the equipped monster unaffected by card effects in addition to the attack and defense increase. Unfortunately, with the advent of kaijus as board breakers, any advantages Alpha might have had to overshadow its detriments as an equip spell have been generally neutralized. Unfortunately, 0 copies. Satellarknight is one of the worst field spells in the game, for increasing XZ monster attack is almost worthless for this deck, and attack negation is almost equally as worthless. Wow, this card is really bad. Stellarnova Wave is alright, but not necessary to run the deck efficiently, and it does not provide more efficiency over the potential inefficiency it provides by being a trap and not producing any immediate benefit. Stellarnova Alpha is just amazing. Some people have argued, oh, well, this card isn't that good because it's technically a break-even. It really shouldn't be banned, or it's a good, solid card, but it's not that great. This logic is heavily flawed. While the pure math is a 2 for 2, sending the monster from the field with the way this deck typically operates is really not much of a cost for all of the pluses that this deck makes when summoning monsters in the numerous ways of putting that monster back onto the field, and if one sends Triverr with material or Delteros, the player will plus off their effects when they go to the graveyard. Also, negating an opponent's card shifts the dual momentum in your favor by either preventing board control change, with Satellarknights thrive on, they want to control the board, they want to have board presence, or preventing the opponent from getting multiple pluses that could heavily shift the momentum in their favor. Overall, if I were to limit any card in this deck ever, it would be Nova Alpha. Fortunately, it's not limited, so run 3 copies, always. For the remainder of the monsters, there are a number of different directions this deck can take. For example, one could run Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit to destroy some rather annoying monsters or face-up card effects the opponent puts on the field, as well as provide some sinker opportunities with the level of recursion this deck runs. Ghost Ogre can even be summoned with recursion during the opponent's standby phase to put some pressure on their plays due to its on-field negation ability being similar to its in-hand negation effect. However, I like running 2 copies of a different synchro engine, Red Resonator. Both the special summon from the hand effect and the life point increase ability work nicely in this deck, producing synchro and grind versatility. Red Resonator being searchable is also really nice, and whenever Red Rising Dragon ever comes out in the TCG, will produce even more benefit for Red Resonator. Finally, closing out the monsters, I run 2 copies of one of my favorite level 4 tech choices, SPYRAL Super Agent. Super Agent serves multiple purposes in this deck. Its innate special summons ability helps make non-Satellarknight XZ plays, especially number 86 summoning, because it's a warrior. Also, since Satellarknights are a grind deck, the information that it provides can be critical regardless of summon success, and its back row destruction ability can help limit the opponent's options for stopping your plays. For the remainder of the spells, I run some obvious choices: 1 copy of Raigeki for field clearance, 1 copy of Soul Charge for number 86 summoning and some more Satellarknight XZ summoning fun, and if Red Resonator's in the graveyard, he can mitigate a lot of the net cost for using Soul Charge, 1 copy of Upstart Goblin for speed, 1 copy of Reinforcement of the Army for searching, 1 copy of Resonator Call for searching Red Resonator, and 1 copy of Instant Fusion for Norden summoning and XZ playmaking. I run 2 copies of Book of Eclipse for board breaking, especially useful when setting up a Triverr summons and also for play interruption. Despite the ability of Triverr to return a card like Swords of Concealing Light to the hand, this quick play aspect of Book of Eclipse to interrupt opponent plays during their turn gives it the nod in my book. Closing out the spells, I run 2 copies of Enemy Controller. Enemy Controller can do a number of useful things in this deck. First, it can be used as a board breaker by taking an important monster or turning it to defense mode. Second, it can prevent the creation of a meaningful board by your opponent during their turn by temporarily snatching a key monster that would start an advantage chain. For example, against Zodiac, you could take Reptare right after they summon it, and if they don't have a follow-up play, well, they're going to get it back at the end phase, but their play has just been stopped. Third, it helps dodge effect negation by the opponent, while also potentially stealing monsters. Fourth, it provides defensive purposes for both Triverr and Delteros, for it sends them to the graveyard as the tribute, dodging bounce, spin, and banish effects, so that they receive their sent to the graveyard summons effects. Fifth, it provides a small level of defense by changing an opponent's monster to defense mode, potentially buying another turn. Note, I do side Twin Twisters, but I do not run them in the main deck. Also, an important note, obviously I choose not to run Card of Demise in this deck, solely because it does not fit my playstyle. For in this deck, if you do not open Demise, it can definitely create some tempo problems due to that you can't special summon condition on the card. However, that issue really should not be enough to stop someone who wants to run it from running it. For the non-direct archetype trap support, there are a wide variety of options to choose from, for this is a trap-heavy deck. Generally, traps for this deck can be broken down into two categories, lockdowns and momentum shifters. Good lockdown choices include Solemn Strike, Solemn Warning, Dimensional Barrier, Anti-Spell Fragrance, Fiendish Chain, Phantom Knight's Fogblade, Goes in Match, and Vanity's Emptiness, whereas good momentum shifters can include the Mirror Force variants, Torrential Tribute, and Needle Sealing, which is actually rather useful in this particular deck. For my lockdown choices, I like running 2 copies of Solemn Strike and 1 copy of Solemn Warning. For the life point costs, they're somewhat mitigated by the presence of Red Resonator and 1 Vanity's Emptiness. While Dimensional Barrier is definitely a quality choice as well, in my mind, its major advantage over the Solemn cards is its first turn shutdown activation. But because this deck is not an explosive one, this advantage Dimensional Barrier has over Solemns, it's difficult to take advantage of that advantage in this deck. I don't run cards like Fiendish Chain or Fogblade in the main deck because I don't think they're effective enough against most of the threats in the meta, despite the potential to be reused with Triverr's effect. For my momentum shifters, I like running 3 copies of Quaking Mirror Force as a means to prevent battle rushes when I draw poorly, for Solemns and Stellarnova Alphas are not useful when you're behind, and 1 Torrential Tribute. Tribute is excellent for this deck as another momentum shifter, especially because it works with Triverr and Delteros' graveyard effects, so you're not that concerned if you have to send them to the graveyard as a part of Torrential Tribute's effect. Finally, I run 3 copies of Call of the Haunted, and 1 copy of Oasis of Dragon Souls to increase overall combo efficiency, and the calls are favored over the Oasis solely for 86 summoning, because remember the Oasis changes the monster it brings back to Worm type, which does not work with 86 summoning. The extra deck for the Satellarknight archetype is definitely one of those where a couple of extra spots would have been nice, balancing all of the potential options. However, that is not the case. My remaining extra deck is as followed: 1 copy Elder Entity Norden, 1 copy Leo, the Keeper of the Sacred Tree, 1 Coral Dragon, 1 Stardust Charge Warrior, 1 number S39 Utopia the Lightning, 1 number 39 Utopia, 1 Abyss Dweller, and 1 number 86. I run Abyss Dweller over Castell right now because I see a little more advantage to Dweller than Castell. Overall, one of the major reasons I would hypothesize Satellarknight play fell off was the general change in play strategy where making a super board became first priority. Satellarknights don't really make super unbreakable boards. Instead, the strength of the Satellarknight deck is the continuous and multiple pluses they receive from both their main deck monsters and their extra deck monsters over many turns of the duel, and the ability of those extra deck monsters to control the field. Interestingly enough, while most players have left for the realm of the kind of min-max speed deck in a sense, perhaps they miss the fact that the fluidity of the Satellarknight archetype has only increased, making the deck even more dangerous. Well, that's my Satellarknight deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.